The Turnaway Study found that 96% of women who gave birth after being denied an abortion ultimately said they no longer wished they'd aborted. When I point out this finding, there are several really common responses from pro-choice people. First, there is straight disbelief, in which case I recommend you go watch our other videos discussing this in a lot more detail. Then they point out that that doesn't mean abortion should be banned, in which case I recommend you watch this video where I explain all the reasons this is important to talk about even if you don't think abortion should be banned. But then they also talk about how even if women ultimately said they no longer wished they'd aborted, it was still bad for them that they couldn't get an abortion. The most commonly cited reason is that the women who couldn't abort ended up having worse financial outcomes than the women who were able to get abortions. First of all, I find this response unbelievably condescending. The women who said they no longer wish they'd aborted are presumably aware of their financial situations, and they still say they didn't wish they aborted. In fact, the Turnaway Study research specifically cited their bonds with their children as a big part of the reason they had retrospective positive evaluations of being denied an abortion. Consider the possibility that a lot of mothers care more about their love for their children than they do about their financial situation. But leaving that aside, the Turnaway Study found that the worst economic outcomes for women who couldn't get abortions tended to be temporary. Here's the specific publication that details this. Notice in the results section when they talk about the worst financial outcomes for women who couldn't get abortions, they're mostly talking about 6 months after the abortion denial. In a couple cases, they're talking about differences that persisted for up to 4 years, but their study went up to 5 years after abortion denial. The reason they're talking about 6 months and 4 years is because 5 years out, most of the economic outcomes converged, meaning that there wasn't a major difference between the women who couldn't get abortions and the women who could. For example, initially the women who couldn't get abortions didn't have as much full-time employment as the women who could get abortions. But by 4 years, there was no statistically significant difference between the groups. Similarly, personal income for the women who couldn't get abortions was lower than for the women who got abortions, at least initially, but after the 6-month mark, it differed little for the rest of the study period. There was also no difference in household income between the women who couldn't get abortions and the women who could, although this statistic is a little bit misleading because the women who couldn't get abortions ended up giving birth, and so their households were larger. So even though they had the same average household income, they were more likely to be living in poverty. But again, that was only initially. By the end of the study period, there was no significant difference between the women who couldn't get abortions and the women who could in terms of whether their households were living in poverty. So the Turnaway Study did find major economic differences between the women who couldn't get abortions and the women who could. This makes sense. You would probably also find major economic differences between women who birthed wanted pregnancies and women who got abortions, because having kids costs money. But what the study's proponents don't talk about is that most of these economic outcomes converged after 5 years. That means that over time, the women who couldn't get abortions ended up having pretty similar economic situations to the women who got abortions. The Turnaway Study researchers focus hard on any disadvantages they find to women who couldn't get abortions, but they focus a lot less on, first of all, the fact that almost every woman who gave birth ended up saying she no longer wanted an abortion, and second of all, on how the economic disadvantages tended to lessen or disappear over time.